Good morning, everyone. I'm Kerry McCallum. I'm Director of the News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today for the launch of Online Misinformation in Australia, Adults' Experiences, Abilities and Responses. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd like to also pay respects to any First Nations people from all the different places that you're joining us from today, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. So this report is part of an ARC linkage project led by Associate Professor Tanya Notley from Western Sydney University. The project is called Addressing Misinformation Using Media Literacy with Public Cultural Institutions. And I have to say, the project and the report couldn't be more timely. We know that high quality and trustworthy news and information leads to better democratic processes. We also know that misinformation causes a wide range of harms. A comprehensive national strategy to combat misinformation is urgently needed, but it's evidence like the evidence that we're going to hear today from projects like Tanya's and reports like this one that are needed to provide the evidence base. So today we launched the Online Misinformation in Australia report that focuses on Australian adults and positions media literacy as an essential component of a response to misinformation. The report's lead author is the News and Media Research Centre's professorial fellow, Professor Sora Park, and its co-authors are Tanya Notley, TJ Thompson, Amy Hourigan and Michael Deswani. The team has conducted surveys, diary studies, verification testing and interviews to explore how socio-cultural dynamics influence people's information seeking and decision-making behaviours. I'm now going to hand over to the project's lead, Tanya Notley, who'll introduce the project, and then she will hand over to Sora and then TJ to share the report's findings. Four of the project's co-authors are with us today, and there'll be an opportunity for you to put your questions in the Q&A, and we can have a discussion once that's been done. And just to let you know that the session is being recorded. So I'm going to hand over now to Tanya.
Thank you so much, Kerry. We'll just bring our slides up. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today for our report launch. Our team were thrilled to see that more than 200 people had registered in just a few weeks for this event, and this includes people from all levels of government, from many government agencies, local NGOs, media organisations, and from libraries and universities. And this tells us that our report is speaking to a national concern that is a priority issue for people, governments, and organisations across the country. I'd like to start this event by providing you with a little bit of background to contextualise the report that we're launching today. As Kerry mentioned in her intro, this report is part of a national project which is funded by the Australian Research Council Linkage Program and by our universities and industry partners. The QR code on the screen will take you to our project website if you'd like to learn more and stay in touch with the research findings. Our research team are interdisciplinary and bring different expertise to the project. At Western Sydney University, I'm joined by co-researchers Dr. Amy Harrigan and Dr. Simon Chambers. Our research team also includes Professor Michael Deswani from Queensland University of Technology, Professor Sora Park from University of Canberra, and Dr. DJ Thompson from RMIT University. I'd also like to mention the critical and generous support that's being provided by our research partners, who are all national public cultural institutions: ABC Education, Australian Library and Information Association, Museum of Australian Democracy, and National Film and Sound Archive of Australia. Our team and partners recognise that addressing misinformation requires a multi-pronged approach, and now this is widely accepted across policy and research. We know we need multiple things, and we need them happening at the same time to face this challenge. So appropriate regulation is needed. Proactive action from platforms is required. Citizens need to be able to access high quality, relevant and timely news and information. And citizens also need education so they can identify misinformation and produce and share high quality news and information with their own personal networks. And this is where our project is focused, on understanding and addressing the education needs of adult Australians. Media literacy is now widely recognised as a critical form of literacy that is essential for full participation in society. We need media literacy to stay connected with family and friends, to find employment, to engage with social services, to take action on issues that matter to us. So to explain what we mean by media literacy, a person is media literate if they're able to access, use, create and share a diverse range of media while critically reflecting on that engagement. But this requires lifelong learning. As media systems and practices change, our knowledge and abilities need to develop as well. So media literacy pedagogy combines educational approaches that support critical thinking, knowledge about media industries and environments, and digital skills. A critical orientation towards media is at the heart of media literacy, and this is often what distinguishes media literacy from other approaches like digital literacy or digital safety, which might not have that focus. To connect our project with international trends, many countries around the world have had government-led or government-supported national media literacy strategies in place for more than a decade, sometimes decades. This includes countries like Finland, Belgium, France, Canada, the Netherlands. In all of those countries that I've just mentioned, there are strong and trusted public cultural institutions with public education mandates. And so these organisations lead or play a very important role in developing the media literacy of citizens. In Australia, our project is connected with the Australian Media Literacy Alliance, UMLA, which comprises national public cultural institutions who are each implementing media literacy projects nationally and who together advocate for a national strategic approach to media literacy in Australia. For the past 12 months, we've been focused in our project on collecting data. As part of this work, we've conducted 4 interrelated studies. So first, we surveyed 3,852 adults, a representative sample of Australians, to understand their media practices, attitudes, and their confidence in their own abilities. Second, we tested the ability of 2,115 of these adults to see if they were able to assess the credibility of information on websites and social media platforms. Next, we supported 55 of these adults to collect data about their experiences with online news and information over 1 week as part of a mobile diary study. And then finally, we interviewed 20 of these participants to explore how sociocultural dynamics influence people's information seeking and their decision-making behaviours. So the report that we're launching today is the second report we've released as part of our project, and it draws on data from the last 3 studies that you can see here on the screen. Our 4 public cultural institution partners are now working to respond to this research data. Each partner organisation will be producing and piloting media literacy projects to help adult Australians identify, avoid and respond to misinformation. And they'll be doing that over the next 12 months as we work with them. So with that introduction, I'll now hand over to Sora Park to begin presenting our research findings.
Thanks, Tanya. Hello, my name is Sora Park, and I'll share some of the key findings from the information verification test, which is the second phase of the study. We gave participants 4 different tasks to test their ability and verify information on websites and social media posts. They were asked to evaluate the content and whether it was reliable and trustworthy, and then explain how they came to that conclusion. They were told that the articles were real-life articles and were asked to imagine that they encountered the example online in real life and asked them to do what they would normally do to check its accuracy. And they were free to search online on any device they had at hand. This is one example of the 4 tasks. This one was designed to assess people's ability to question and evaluate social media posts that have multiple components, text, image, comments from other users that can have conflicting messages. It was a real-life post by Lyle Shelton, who is an Australian conservative politician and activist. The post is implying election misconduct through a photo of ballot boxes being moved. We selected this task given that misinformation often comes in form of innuendo that suggests something might be problematic. The task assessed people's ability to identify who the author of the post is by searching online and to determine the potential agenda that might be involved. We also assessed people's ability to critically evaluate and fact-check the suggestion being made in the post that the photos may be showing election misconduct. It's relatively easy to find information online with 2 fact-checked articles clearly outlining why this suggestion of improper behavior is false. You can also easily find information about the post author. We had 3 other similar tasks. One was an Instagram post with incorrect labeling, another about sponsored content on a news website, and another one comparing Wikipedia to an advocacy website. You can see them in detail in the report, but for the sake of time, I'll just now share some of the key findings. The first finding is that the vast majority of adult Australians scored poorly on all 4 tasks. I'll show you the actual scores in a minute, but first, I'd like to explain how we scored the responses and group people based on their scores. In all of the 4 tasks, the first question had a correct answer, yes or no. Those who selected the incorrect answer were classified as disqualified and were automatically assigned a 0 score. The second question asked participants to explain how they reached the conclusion. For those who gave the correct answer in the first question, we marked their open text responses according to a detailed rubric. We gave marks for a range of answers, including questioning the source, searching for the authenticity of the source, identifying bias or agenda in a story. You can see in the table below the raw scores for each task, and you can see that the score is very low. Only about 1 to 3% of the respondents received a full mark for each task, and the vast majority scored 0. We then combined the scores from the 4 tasks to come up with an aggregate score that ranges from 0 to 8. We grouped the respondents into 3 categories based on their scores in the 4 tasks: no ability, 0, emerging ability, 1 to 3, and developing ability, 4 to 8 marks. The results raise serious concerns about the ability of adult Australians to identify misinformation online. Almost half, 45%, showed no ability to take basic steps to verify information, and 52% had only an emerging ability. Only 3% of respondents were ranked with a developing ability, which means they scored at least 4 out of 8 marks, meaning they got at least half of the marks. Another important finding is that the ability to verify information online is low across the board, across all age groups. There wasn't much of a difference between age groups, but older people tended to score slightly lower. There were other factors that were related to respondents' ability. Education was an important factor. Those with a bachelor's degree and above are more likely to score higher. 60% of those with low education scored 0, and compared to 38% of those with high education. Another indication of people's ability to verify information is their awareness of the term media literacy. We asked respondents whether they were familiar with the word media literacy in the first adult media literacy survey. There was a strong association between awareness of this term and their actual ability to verify information online. Only 35% of those who said they were familiar with the term scored 0, compared to 50% of those who said they were not familiar. The second key finding is people's online behaviors and attitudes were related to their ability to verify information. Based on the number of social media platforms people used in the past week, we group people into heavy, 6 or more platforms, moderate, 3 to 6, light, 1 to 2 platforms, and non-users. Adults who don't use any social media scored the lowest in the information verification test, with 55% of this group being in the no ability group. This is a 15 percentage point gap between the heavy user group. It's likely that those who are used to social media platforms and use it a lot may know more about the ways in which information can be shown to them. There was an even larger gap between heavy and non-news consumers. Only 36% of heavy news consumers were in the no ability category, compared to 59% of non-news consumers. That is a 24% difference. This indicates that regularly accessing quality information verified by journalists may help people distinguish fact-based and fact-checked stories from other information. In our adult media literacy survey, we asked people if they were confident in checking if a website can be trusted and whether they can check if something they found online is true. About 42% and 39% said they were confident, respectively. As you can see, the overall confidence level is very low. However, their actual ability is even lower. While those with high confidence generally scored higher than those with low confidence, I'd like to note that among those who felt confident that they could check if something they found online is true, a large proportion, 39%, scored 0 across all 4 tasks. 40% of those saying they are confident they can check if a website can be trusted also scored 0 on all of the tasks. There are many people who are confident but are not able to demonstrate actual ability, showing that people are overestimating their ability to verify information. To better understand the approaches and usefulness of the strategies people adopt when they are encountered with dubious information, we qualitatively analyzed the written justification in the open text answers. This revealed a few unhelpful strategies people were applying when trying to verify information. Here are some examples of why people misjudge the post or web page. First, many people applied blanket cynicism or judgment based on their assumption that certain institutions, media, or platforms can or cannot be trusted, without investigating or providing a reason as to why that might be the case. Many people said things like, "You can't trust anything on social media." People also made decisions based on their existing beliefs without further investigating the claims made in a post or questioning the source. For example, people would say things like, anyone can edit Wikipedia, so it can't be true. There were many responses that talk about past experiences as their reason, or focusing on the appearance of the post or web page. We found that many people accept content at face value, mostly based on their gut feeling or emotional response, rather than questioning the content itself. These unhelpful strategies prevented people from engaging in lateral reading to verify sources and information, or searching information to verify the facts. Even fewer people conducted things like reverse image search. I'll now pass over to my colleague and co-author, TJ Thompson, who will present some of the findings from the diary and interview study.
Thank you, Sora. Thank you all for joining us. So over the next 12 or so minutes, I have the pleasure of guiding us through the qualitative components of the project. So Sora's just spoken to some of the nationally representative data that gives us a nice sense of breadth overall in Australia. How are we doing with this issue? And with the qualitative components, we can get a better sense of depth and richness and nuance to look into the everyday experiences of online misinformation that people are encountering and responding to. So to do this and try to get this richness and depth, we had two qualitative dimensions. The first of these was a mobile diary study. So we asked our participants, 55 of them, to kind of keep track for a week and share with us the examples of news and information that they encounter organically in their routines every day. So on day one, we said, introduce yourself with a selfie video, let us know who you are, where you're coming from, what you do, what your online information and news-seeking information behaviors look like. And then in days 2 to 6, we asked folks to document and share with us examples of the news and information they consume, and to reflect each night on the examples they shared in terms of their trustworthiness. Then on the last day of the week, we asked them to reflect on the week as a whole and to give us a sense of, is this a more or less representative, typical week of online information and news searching for you? Or is it a bit of an outlier or atypical week for some reasons? Maybe you're on holidays or traveling, that kind of thing. So we tried to get a lot of context from folks over this 1 week diary study through the examples that folks shared with us. After we had the diary study, we then had a fourth component, which was the follow-up interview component. And my colleague Amy Harrigan and I interviewed folks, 20 participants, to try to get a little bit more understanding of the examples they shared, a little bit more depth and richness, as well as get some ideas about their media literacy interests and needs, online information verification behaviors, and their trust in various information sources. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The first of our key findings was that the majority of our participants did find and encounter organically misinformation in that 1 week period. So about 80% of our diary study participants found misinformation, things that were false, misleading, or they thought were not trustworthy in some way. Participants shared with us more than 1,600 examples of claims they found online during that 1 week period. And for a qualitative study, 1,600 claims is a lot to kind of work through and analyze and parse. So it's taken a lot of coding work to get to a sense of what's happening with this data. We've tried to get that done for us all today. And if we look at the average number of misinformation claims per person per week, it was about 7.5 claims on average per person per week for the folks who did encounter misinformation in that 1 week period. You can see here some concrete examples of some of the types of claims that people were finding organically and sharing with us in this diary study. So I think really pleasingly, about a quarter of our sample was culturally and linguistically diverse, folks who spoke a language other than English at home. And so we had examples in different languages. We had examples that were coming to us in different communication modes, some that were in written format, some that in visual format, like the video in the middle, and some that were in audio format, like the podcast on the right. We also saw lots of different platforms where the claims were coming from. So Facebook, TikTok, Spotify, lots of different platforms as well that were involved with sharing or amplifying these claims that participants thought were dodgy or false or misleading. So we looked at 3 different aspects in our analysis to date. The first of those aspects was what kind of topic is related to these misinformation claims that people are finding and sharing with us. So are these claims about, health information or health news, political news, that kind of thing? We found that in our diary study, economics was the most prevalent claim. So people have a lot of concern, I think, about economics. We're in a cost of living crisis. And so kind of our wallets and our dollar and the bottom line is really top of mind for a lot of people. And we're kind of perhaps more attuned to seeing information about money and about the wider economic system in terms of people trying to influence politics and discourse through focusing on the economics frame. We also saw a fair bit of misinformation about celebrity. So either misinformation about celebrities or misinformation that used celebrities to try to impersonate them and say, buy our product because Dr. So-and-so has endorsed our product when actually that doctor hadn't actually endorsed or vetted that product. We also saw a fair bit of misinformation on crime and crisis. So if we go to the next slide, we can see some concrete examples of each of these different topics. So at left, an example of the economics topic. In the middle, an example from the celebrity topic category, and on the right, an example from the crime and crisis category. We can see here kind of a breakdown of the different topics overall. So again, we've already mentioned business economics, celebrity and crime and crisis as the top 3. But I think kind of just stepping back and taking a little bit of a step back, this kind of helps us appreciate that misinformation isn't just about the kind of dry, boring, serious topics, if you will, like politics or health. Misinformation can kind of be attached to or related to lots of different topics, things like sports, things like entertainment, things like celebrity. Those are also as likely in some cases to be attached to misinformation as are the kind of traditional suspects like politics and health news and information. In our second part of the analysis, we looked at the communication mode that the claim was relayed through. So is this a claim coming through a infographic, a chart, a video, a social media post, an audio story or a podcast, that kind of thing? And in our diary study, folks found the highest number of misinformation, false misleading claims in written or text-based format. So about 60% or so of the misleading claims that folks found and shared with us were in written text-based format. And of those, headlines were quite prevalent. And I think that kind of speaks to how people engage with the online environment. Oftentimes you're just kind of scrolling through and seeing lots of headlines. You might not necessarily take the time to stop and click or tap into a story and get more context. You just kind of see the headline and go on. So I think headlines were really prevalent because of how people use the internet and look through social media oftentimes. We can see an example here of some of these text-based claims. And in this example, it wasn't the headline, it wasn't the image, it was the written text of the article itself that participants thought were either false, misleading, or untrustworthy in some way. And our third bit of analysis was on the source of misinformation. But before we get to that sourcing question, we'll just pop back one slide, sorry, and just have a little bit of a gander at our findings overall with the different modes. So as I said before, more than 60% were in written text format. We had what we called multimodal format as well, so the mixing of more than one mode, so text with image or image with video, that kind of thing. Video by itself at 11%, image by itself at 3%, and audio by itself at 1%. And as I mentioned, our last key finding was about sourcing. So who or what is either creating these claims and propagating them or sharing them or amplifying them? And surprisingly, I think very surprisingly, at least for me, was that mainstream and alternative news sources were the top most prevalent purveyors of what folks in our diary study were considering as false, misleading, or untrustworthy information. So this perhaps speaks to low trust in news and news media, polarization perhaps a little bit, but there were other sources of misinformation as well. We can go to the next slide and have a little bit of a look at those other sources. Within mainstream alternative news sources, about 80% of these sources were domestic news or alternative or mainstream domestic news. The remaining 20% were international. So you have a little bit of a mix between here, kind of Aussie-grown misinformation and overseas misinformation. And if you go to the next slide, we can see kind of a breakdown of the source across different categories. And I can just, if I scroll through my own little slides here, just to get my notes up in front of me, we have a few more granular findings about the social media breakdown. So that second category, the 18% of claims in social media, these were 60% by meta platforms, so Facebook and Instagram, 40% shared on Reddit, on X, 7%, YouTube, 5%, and TikTok, 1%. So that kind of just gives you a little bit more clarity on where on social media those 18% of claims are coming from. And you can see here in descending order remaining sources of misinformation that participants shared with us. So our kind of final key finding leaves us on a positive, helpful note, because we found that a majority of Australians do want access to media literacy support. And I think that's very encouraging for all of us. They also want governments to kind of step up and do their fair share and platforms to do their fair share as well. So 80%, 4 in 5 Australians agree that misinformation is an issue, is a problem that we want to tackle and address. And I think very pleasingly, 93%, very overwhelming majority, want to be taught how to identify misinformation. The survey slides that Sora spoke to earlier kind of speak to folks' lack of ability to do this. So there definitely needs to be more training and education, we think, on how to identify misinformation. People think that platforms should be doing more to monitor, label, and remove misinformation, and that governments have a role to play as well in terms of helping social media remove misinformation that could be harmful to consumers online. So with that being said, I think we can pass to Carrie again for our Q&A. I think we already have some questions in the Q&A and look forward to having a discussion with you all in the coming minutes.
Thanks so much, TJ, Tanya, and Sora, and Amy is also here for that, extraordinary, level of detail and explanation. It did raise some questions, and I would just urge everybody, unfortunately, because of the large number of people in the audience, we'd like you to write down your questions in the using the Q&A function. And then I'll read them out and the panelists will address them. So thank you once again. We've got a couple of questions here. The first two actually relate to one another and they're methodological. So the first one is from Reese. Were participants provided an incentive for correctly identifying misinformation and providing evidence? And Toby Reich had a similar question. Did participants have any incentive to put in the effort required to do the cross-verification and searching? So who would like to start?
I can answer that. So yes, it was the respondents were part of a panel, research panel. So the participants who were in the first adult media literacy survey, about 3,500 people, of those, about 2,000 people were invited to the information verification test. Similar to when you invite somebody to do an online survey, the length was no longer than like 15 minutes. And they were given 4 tasks, and they received the normal compensation that they receive as a panel member. So the answer is yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Any of the other, no more comments? So I've got one from Zainab Zaidi, and about the scoring scheme. It could be noisy due to the biases of the scorer. And then they explain, is your scoring more focused on the articulation capacity of the participant or understanding? So I'm not sure who would like to answer that question.
I can answer.
Go ahead, Zora.
Okay, so that's a really good question, and the team did think a lot about how to make it a standardized, scoring system. So we developed a very detailed rubric amongst us, and then we tested it several times, and we trained the coders to do the coding based on the rubric, and we also calculated the intercoder reliability to make sure that anyone who marks the answers based on the rubric will mark it the same way. And we had a very high score for each of the 4. I can't remember the exact details. It's in the report, but they were above 95% agreement. So we're quite confident that we didn't have any bias in the marking. And to answer that question about the articulation, yes, some people can articulate their thoughts better than others, and we tried not to consider that, like anything like grammar or any style. Those things were not considered. We tried to look at the content of the response.
Great. Now I have a question here from Ashley Hoare, and I'll read it out. It's longish. I agree that it's imperative to tackle the media literacy issue, but information accessibility is the most vital currency of information literacy and requires structural rather than individual level change. I'd be interested in knowing a bit more about it and how identity characters such as race, language, and disability factored into your analyses. For migrants and people with disabilities in particular, the problem of inaccessible communication is a persistent barrier to their information resilience and renders them especially susceptible to mis or disinformation. There are specific resources and knowledge about these lived experiences that we need in order to address the information access issues that make these communities more vulnerable. And I'd love to know if your project team is planning to look more closely at these demographics or examine the accessibility and misinformation nexus in more depth. Great question. Tanya, would you like to go with that one?
Sure, yeah, thanks for the question, Ashley. Many members of the team are also digital inclusion researchers, so it's always front of mind, understanding how some groups are excluded by platform and technology affordances. So it's something we're always looking at. Our adult media literacy survey across all the questions and analysis looks at the issue of disability, and we do find that people who identify as having a disability do have lower levels of confidence and also have a lower level of digital media use. So that's a real issue. We offered the adult media literacy survey in 5 languages other than English, the top languages spoken in Australia. It's something we look very closely at. And across the study, you know, when it came to the diary study, we selected people, 20%, I think it was, who speak a language other than English in the home. So we're very much cognizant and looking at that, and we've always try and point to that in our analysis. So I think it's a really important issue, and one that we've really tried to carefully consider in the design of our study. Across the study, the biggest factor that influences people's media use, their confidence, their abilities, is education level. We find it's the largest factor influencing the results, and that's a steady result across the different studies that we've done. But we're certainly looking at all those factors, and you'll be able to see that in the analysis, particularly in the earlier report that we released, the Adult Media Literacy Survey. And if I could just jump to Phoebe's question as well quickly, she asked why people are more likely to perceive misinformation on meta platforms in contrast to TikTok. I think that's simply an issue of the percentage of people who are using those platforms. In our Adult Media Literacy Survey, we look at use. Meta Facebook is used far more than any other platform still in Australia. Obviously, TikTok has more popularity with particular age demographics, so we break things down by age as well. But I think that that's an issue of the majority of Australians, vast majority of Australians using meta platforms, which is not so the case across age groups for TikTok.
Can I just add one quick thing to Ashley's question as well? I agree that information access is very critical. And I think one thing from the follow-up interviews that I can add to this discussion was the influence of algorithms. And that's something that we haven't really talked about much yet in this presentation today. But we kind of asked folks, how do you feel about algorithms? And do you think that algorithms kind of are helping or hurting our ability to become informed participants in a democracy? And people kind of had this very ambivalent response. They said, on one hand, you know, algorithms give me relevant content. They give me stuff that I want to see. But on the other hand, algorithms aren't designed to be helping people be civically literate or civically engaged. They're designed to make money and keep people on the platform. So algorithms aren't really designed to help people get information that might be not perhaps perceived as entertaining, but perhaps as important in terms of civic functions or democratic functions, that kind of thing. So just one little contribution from the diary study and findings, follow-up interviews on the topic of information access vis-a-vis algorithms.
Thanks. Got a question from Greg Hall. By what criteria did the researchers determine levels of education of the participants? I.e., were they invited to self-identify their level of education? I think this education piece is really important, and yeah.
Yes, so we did ask in the Adult Media Literacy Survey, what is the highest education qualification that you have completed? And we gave a list of options ranging from I didn't complete any formal education to postgraduate degree. So respondents would select from the options, and then we group them into low, medium, and high. High meaning if the respondent answered bachelor's degree or above, were classified as high education. So it's based on self-reports of their education level.
And I can take that question from Reese. So Reese is asking, with the diary study, were the examples of misinformation captured all cases of what participants thought were misinformation, or were they verified by us as being misinformation? So the short answer is it was their perceptions of what they thought were false and misleading claims. In the last 4 or 5 months, we've only had time to look at those 3 aspects of source, topic, and mode of claim. There are 1,600 claims, and so it's a really big data set for qualitative work to get through. But I'm hopeful in the coming months and perhaps years, we'll have time to kind of fact check and see for ourselves if we can objectively assess the veracity of the claims and kind of get a sense of how many are just perceived as being false versus actually are false and misleading in some way.
Daisy DeWint says, thank you for sharing these fascinating results. How did the results compare to your initial expectations? Were there any major surprises?
I imagine that's something we can all answer because, you know, as researchers, we always are looking at, like, you know, we're always so motivated by what's going to surprise us here. And I guess sometimes buck the assumptions that people have. For me, it was absolutely one of the surprises was the diary study, that so many of the examples people selected as being misinformation, they identified them as being misinformation, were from mainstream news or media organizations. So that's something that we all really need to think about, because I think the conversation about misinformation is dominated by these external, nefarious, unknown actors, and is less so about news and media organizations. And I think what we can see from the diary study is people are really frustrated by clickbait and by misleading headlines that are meant to get them, to bring them to the news story. And I think it's causing some widespread distrust and ultimately harms news media. So there might be some short wins because people click through, but then people are really frustrated to feel they're misled. So I think that that was a huge surprise for me and something that I'll be thinking about for a while. But I'm sure maybe we could pass over to everyone for that question.
That was surprising to me as well. I concur with Tanya, but also I think within that news and alternative news category, the proportion between domestic and international, so having 80% domestic and only 20% international, there's perhaps not much influence coming from overseas as people might imagine in popular discourse, perhaps. So a lot of kind of homegrown Aussie misinformation that we're grappling with from that bit of data.
My surprise was when I first got the data back on the information verification test, and the score was so low, I had to check multiple times to see if that was the actual score. But then we modeled a study conducted by Stanford History Education Group, and their results are quite comparable. So after that, yeah, I knew the data was correct, but it was still a shocking finding to find out that people had such low ability to verify information.
Okay, we've got a question from Alexandra Lee. It is interesting that both mainstream and alternative news outlets emerged. We might have addressed some of this as the common source of misinformation identified by participants. Would you say these sources are the highest priority to address? If so, what's the implication of this, considering that much discussion around addressing misinformation is focused on social media platforms? Is there a need to better understand the role of news outlets? And do you have any ideas how? I think, yeah. There's a lot there.
Yeah, I completely agree, Alexandra. And yeah, I think that there does need to be a bit of a shift that involves news organizations and an understanding of the implications of poor quality journalism, misleading headlines, clickbait, inappropriate use of images, because perhaps from their perspective, sometimes there's short-term gains, but what we can see is long-term harm. And so I do think that this is something that we need to be discussing. And I guess the point of the diary study was really to try and understand the everyday experience. And so it's just such a rich data source to have people at the end of the day reflecting on what their experience was. We didn't just ask them, we asked them for examples of things they thought were high quality and trustworthy, and the opposite as well. So there's a lot more for us to reflect there on that. And I guess that can lead into Carly's question, who's saying that she says that it was interesting that those who didn't use any social media had the lowest score when it came to identifying misinformation. And that relates to the recent legislation that aims to ban young people from social media until they're 16 years old. Might there be something to think about there? I think absolutely. So I think it's important to note that 2 of the questions were from social media platforms, Instagram and Facebook, 2 most popular platforms. So obviously people who are completely unfamiliar with that, perhaps maybe that could have had an impact that they weren't sure on, what the verification process would be. So I do think it's important that we work out how we're going to ensure young people are supported to become media literate on social media platforms, whether or not, the ban goes ahead or in what form. I think it's really important. We can see from our research with young people that they're not getting this education in schools, and that very often social media is ignored. And so it's really critical that they understand how to do due diligence and fact checking and source checking on those platforms. And so, it's an issue, and we can see that actually just using different platforms and technologies does help you gain some form of digital skills that would help you in this test. So it's really important that we're not just making no effort here because we think young people are not going to be on these platforms. We've definitely got to address that.
Jarlan has a question. She's curious about what kinds of topics were covered in the survey and what the choice of topics might have impacted the results. And I think this relates to the first report. Is that right?
I assume it's a question about the topics we used in the verification test. Yeah, we tested a lot of different topics before we decided on the 4 posts and articles. And we tried to have a diverse range of it. But having said that, yes, definitely the choice of topics would impact the results and it will depend on the individual's interest in the topic. So those things need to be considered. Yeah.
Miguel de Souza, really agree with you about the effects of the lashings of false connection context used in news media. Do you think this is undermining its long-term effectiveness as part of the solution to low media literacy? I can see Tanya nodding.
Yeah, look, I think that they're 2 sides of the coin. People need to have reliable, trustworthy news and information. And on the other side, they have to have the ability to verify information. But, one of the barriers that we could see, a key barrier we could see emerging was this cynicism. And that's what's a real worry. I think skepticism, can be very healthy when you're questioning news media and whether it's correct. But when that leads to cynicism and all news media are biased, those kinds of claims, then that is really harmful. And it means that people don't know where to look, particularly when there's a crisis or an event unfolding. So I think it does harm media literacy efforts, and we need to make sure that news and media are reliable. People also understand processes of fact checking. I know from my own teaching that a lot of people don't understand fact checking processes, and it's not visible to them, and they don't know how this kind of works in newsrooms. So I think there also needs to be more education about the way newsrooms work as well. TJ, you might want to add to that.
I think that was a very comprehensive answer, Tanya. You answered it very well. I'm happy to take the next question from Greg.
Yeah, I was going to say the next one looks like you, TJ.
Yep. Thank you, Carrie. So Greg's asking about date-wise, when were the one-on-one interviews conducted? From memory, end of May, beginning of June, so in the last 4 or 5 months or so. And he's asking also, were the diary study participants invited as to whether they would be happy to be interviewed, or were they selected against some sort of criteria? 2 kind of answers to that. One is that people didn't kind of sign up to all 4 stages at once. They at the end of each stage were invited to participate in the next stage. So it wasn't like they signed up for all 4 at once, the survey 1, survey 2, diary study, and follow-up interviews. And then in the second question, we did try to assemble a diverse group of folks for our diary study participants. About half were regional, half were urban. I mentioned before, 28% were called culturally linguistically diverse folks. So there were some kind of criteria in place to try to get some diversity across, geography, education, age, culturally linguistically diverse status, gender, that kind of thing. But it's also just who would also consent. So we had to kind of balance who would be happy to participate in the next phase of the research, as well as try to get some diversity across those key variables. So it was a bit of both.
And the last two questions also relate. Did your research find differences in media consumption patterns of certain demographics, i.e. race or ethnic background? Did this influence the type of misinformation these groups were susceptible to? And, oh, sorry, they keep jumping around. And yeah, okay. Does your study include insights into connections between misinformation and racism? So perhaps two sides of the same coin. Misinformation that uses racial stereotypes. Yeah.
I think at least for the qualitative data, that's still kind of in train and forthcoming. So we've had time just to do the aggregate kind of broad contours of the data in terms of source, mode, and topic. But I think we can definitely in future months drill down and look at a particular demographic attribute and see how, cold folks versus non-cold folks, or urban versus non-urban, or high education versus low education, the types of examples they share, and if they are related to racism, that kind of thing. That'd be interesting, I think, and agree to do. So watch this space.
Anyone else on the race and ethnicity questions?
Just to say, for the adult media literacy survey, we have a culturally and linguistically diverse booster sample. As I said, it was provided in 5 languages other than English, the top languages other than English spoken in Australia. So we have looked at that very closely in the adult media literacy survey data, and you can find that detail right across the report. I'm not sure if there's anything to add on that, Sora.
Momoko has a question. What might be the implications of the findings for social media companies trying to detect misinformation?
Well, I would say that from the first survey, we asked people if misinformation on social media is a platform. 4 in 5 Australians that needs to be addressed. 4 in 5 Australians say yes. And what they want to be done about that is they want media literacy initiatives, they want government to introduce legislation to address this, and they want social media platforms to label and remove misinformation. So there is the public support there, and I think it's really important to recognise that and to respond to that. So hopefully that's useful information for social media companies about, this is a nationally representative survey of adult Australians. So hopefully that's something that will want to take on board.
Okay. Jump in if I've missed any questions, but we are getting to the end of time. Did your research distinguish between participants' ability to discern hard news and opinion in journalism? I suppose that's a question about, the types of misinformation people were.
No, we had 4 examples, and so we didn't do that. I do think from the other research that we're all doing and from the teaching that we're doing that is an important issue. I often find in the teaching and the work that I do for different audiences that often hard news, or what is news and what is opinion, does get collapsed by people, and that's a reality. And of course it becomes even more of a reality when those labels are lost, when content moves to social media. So I do think it's an important question, but not one that we looked at in this verification study.
Amy, did you have anything more to add, or no? All good. I've got one from Girish. Thanks, very interesting and valuable research. Do you have data or a sense of the actual consequences of misinformation for people's perceptions or actions? Even though people might have identified something as misinformation, do you have any sense of whether or not they were still influenced by that misinformation? Put another way, do people still act on misinformation even though they suspect or know it's information? Great question.
Not sure, Amy or TJ, if that came up in the diary study and the interviews.
Yeah, I do definitely. There's harms of encountering misinformation. One kind of example and anecdote I can remember and point us toward was this fellow who's kind of very skeptical and cynical about expertise and not really trusting or wanting to hear from experts on topics that matter. So I think the example was financial information. How do you kind of get information about financial decisions and make those decisions? How do you kind of get information to support your decisions financially? And he was saying, you know, I would never go to a financial expert or a bank or a mortgage broker or anyone, you know, with the background or qualifications in that topic. I'd much rather kind of go to a community group on social media and ask who knows who with who knows what background or qualifications or credentials to kind of just weigh in and give me a wide range of opinions. And so I don't think anyone in our diary study kind of admitted saying, yes, I know this is false or misleading, but I still trust it. But I think there was that kind of still acknowledgement that even if it doesn't have anything backing it, that's not necessarily evidence or qualifications or credentials backing it, I still trust this because I have this fear or aversion to authority or experts or whatever the case was. Yeah, if that helps at all. A little kind of obscure anecdote, if that helps at all.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. We certainly could see in that rich quality of data, people looking for trusted sources and, you know, trying to make a decision about who they turn to for information. So that issue of trust is a really critical one to this research, I think.
Can I add one thing quickly as well? I think as well, we also saw people in the diary study videos in reflecting on their information and news seeking habits in a way that I think points to maybe some of the information access and information literacy comments that were being made earlier. So we had people who, in identifying something as misinformation as part of the diary study, maybe then looking and going, well, actually, you know, I can see that my distinction of this as misinformation is because I have a bias towards that particular, you know, in this case, I'm thinking of an example, which was a news source. And so noting that perhaps the information itself might not actually be misinformation, but because they have this perceived bias towards the source, they have a tendency to not trust that particular outlet or that particular source of information. So people were making really quite nuanced personal reflections or self-reflections in a certain number of cases of things that we found in the diary study. But, you know, like TJ has said, 1,600 examples is a lot of content to go through. And I think looking at that aspect is one that we have definitely slated for further analysis.
Just to add to that as well, so I think that's a really important question because in a different study that I conduct, we ask people, have you encountered misinformation? A lot of people say they don't know, meaning they actually don't know if they've encountered misinformation. So knowing that not knowing it's misinformation and consuming that content and basing their decisions on that is what is really dangerous. And that's what we don't know about studies like this, is that who are all these people who are making their everyday decisions based on incorrect information that they don't know is misinformation.
And that leads us to our very last question comment from Saffron Howden. Thanks everyone, fascinating and scary. I'm so pleased to be working with Sora to develop a tool to teach media literacy skills to adults. So that's a nice positive end. I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists. And Tanya, did you have one last word?
Just thanks so much for everyone for joining us. And obviously we're releasing the report today and would love for you to help us to share this widely. So I don't know if we've put the link in the chat the report, but we can do that now. So yeah, just thanks so much for taking time to be with us today, and thank you to the research team. It's been a great pleasure working with you all. Thanks, Kerry.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.